June 7th, 1916. The air inside Fort Vaux is 120 degrees. It is a foul, unbreathable mixture, thick with the smell of blood, chloride of lime, and death. Major Raynal, his lips cracked and black from dehydration, watches his men, 600 of France's toughest soldiers, finally collapse. They have not tasted a single drop of water in 3 days. They are reduced to licking the slime and condensation from the damp tunnel walls. Above them, the muffled thud, thud, thud of German pioneers still trying to dynamite their way in. But the soldiers in the dark know the truth. The real enemy is no longer German. It is thirst. The battle for Fort Vaux does not begin in isolation. It is an island of horror nested inside a continental inferno, a single bloody chapter in the longest and most monstrous battle of the First World War. It is born at Verdun. In February 1916, the German Chief of Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, initiated Operation Gericht, Operation Judgment. Falkenhayn was not just a strategist. He was a cold, calculating gambler who viewed the Great War as a mathematical equation of resources. The resource he intended to drain was not territory, but French blood. He saw the deadlock on the Western Front, the endless miles of trenches and wire, and understood that a traditional breakthrough, the kind generals dreamed of, was likely impossible. He needed a different, more cynical weapon. He needed to break the will of the French army, not just its front line. His eyes fell upon the ancient fortress city of Verdun. Verdun was not just a military asset on a map. It was a symbol. It was the psychological heart of France, a bastion against Germany since the days of Attila the Hun, a place of such profound national pride that the French government could never, ever abandon it, no matter the cost. Falkenhayn's logic was as simple as it was inhuman. He would not attack Verdun to capture it. He would attack it to force France to defend it. He would lure the entire French army into a kill zone, a furnace just a few miles wide, and he would feed France's divisions into that furnace one by one until there was nothing left. He would exsanguinate an entire nation. He would, in his own chilling words, bleed France white. This, at least, is the story that is often told. The famous Christmas memo outlining this precise strategy of pure attrition is now a subject of intense historical debate. A growing consensus of historians analysing Falkenhayn's actual battlefield conduct now see this memo as a convenient fiction, a post-war justification penned by a general who did fail to achieve a conventional breakthrough and later claimed he never intended to in the first place. His plan was likely a more traditional pincer movement, which simply failed. But the debate over the intent is almost academic. The result was undeniable. When the offensive began at 7:15 a.m. on February 21st, 1916, it was an apocalypse. Over 1,200 German artillery pieces, an unprecedented concentration of firepower, opened fire on a narrow front just 8 miles wide. The bombardment lasted for 9 hours. It was not a battle, it was an industrial extermination. Millions of shells rained down, a storm of high explosives, shrapnel, and poison gas that shattered the earth and the minds of the men hiding within it. The forests of Verdun, ancient woodlands, vanished in hours, reduced to a hellish moonscape of splintered stumps and poisoned, churned mud. The sound of the trommelfeuer, the drum fire, was so loud it could be heard in Paris, 150 miles away. This was not war as any soldier had ever known it. This was Die Mühle, the mill, the meat grinder. French soldiers sent to the front were not told to fight. They were told to survive. In the chaos, as the French defences buckled and the government in Paris began to panic, command was given to General Philippe Pétain. Pétain was the antithesis of the French army's offensive-minded establishment. He was a grim, methodical, defensive specialist, a cold logistician whose entire philosophy was built on a simple, brutal truth. Le feu tue. Fire kills. He understood that this was not a battle of courage, but a battle of artillery and supply. He immediately organised the only viable supply line, a single, narrow road running into the city, which became known to all of France as La Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Way. For months, thousands of trucks drove bumper to bumper, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in an endless, grinding loop. One truck passed a single point every 14 seconds. They fed men, ammunition and food into the grinder and carried the endless stream of wounded and broken men out. Pétain's famous order of the day echoed across France. On les aura. We shall have them. It was not a cry of passion. It was a cold promise of unbreakable mathematical resilience. But just as the defence began to stabilise, the unthinkable happened. On February 25th, only 4 days into the battle, the largest, strongest and most modern fortress at Verdun, Fort Vaux, fell. It was the linchpin of the entire defensive network. And it fell not to a bloody, month-long siege. It was captured by a handful of German pioneers from the 24th Brandenburg Regiment, led by a Sergeant Kunze. They had been sent to probe the defences and simply found an open, undefended passage. The fort, which French propaganda had called invincible, had been largely stripped of its garrison and guns the year before by a high command that believed forts were obsolete. The Germans didn't fight their way in. They walked in. The greatest fortress in the world had been taken by 10 men without firing a shot. The shock to French morale was catastrophic. France was reeling. The German army, emboldened by this absurd victory, now pivoted. Their advance continued, their artillery shifted, and all German eyes and all German guns turned to the next obstacle in their path. They turned to its smaller, older, and seemingly insignificant neighbour, just to the south. They turned to Fort Vaux. Fort Vaux was a ghost long before the first German Sturmtruppen set foot on its roof. It was a concrete coffin, a monument to a forgotten age of warfare, a tomb built in the 1880s. Its very existence was a national response to a previous trauma. It was a product of the Serré de Rivière system, the vast, sprawling 19th century defensive network that France constructed following the profound national humiliation of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. General Raymond Adolphe Serré de Rivière, its chief architect, envisioned a barrier of iron and concrete that would stretch across the newly truncated border with the lost provinces of Alsace and Lorraine. It was a strategy born of fear and pride, a promise that Paris would never again fall so easily. Fort Vaux, like its larger brother Douaumont, was a masterpiece of that specific era. It was an angular, semi-submerged structure of concrete and earth, a geometric marvel of interlocking fields of fire engineered to withstand the solid iron cannonballs and black powder shells of the 1880s. Its walls were thick, laid with concrete and compacted earth designed to absorb kinetic impact. Its moat was deep. Its guns, housed in armoured steel turrets or concrete casemates, were positioned with mathematical precision, creating a web of steel from which no 19th century army could escape. Upon its completion, it was considered by the finest military minds in Europe, including the Germans themselves, to be impregnable. But this was 1916, and in the 30 years since its construction, the science of killing had evolved far faster than the science of defence. A technological arms race had occurred, centred not on guns, but on explosives. The invention of picric acid-based high explosives, melinite in France, lyddite in Britain, Granatfüllung 88 in Germany, changed everything. These new torpedo shells, or obus torpille, did not just shatter on impact. They detonated with a force that was orders of magnitude greater than black powder. The enemy was no longer firing solid shot. They were firing high explosive shells, Minenwerfer, massive trench mortars, and super heavy siege artillery that had fundamentally rewritten the rules of war. The German 420mm Big Bertha and the Austrian 305mm Skoda howitzers, first unveiled against the Belgian forts at Liège and Namur in 1914, had proven that this entire concept of fortification was obsolete. These new shells did not just chip away at concrete, they did not bounce off. They plunged deep into the earthworks and masonry, penetrating many feet of reinforced concrete before detonating with an unimaginable force that turned casemates into tombs. They pulverized fortifications, cracked structures open like eggs, and killed the garrisons inside through sheer earth-shattering concussion. The French High Command, led by General Joseph Joffre, saw this. They watched the Belgian forts, identical in principle to their own, disintegrate in a matter of hours, not days. And Joffre, a man whose entire military philosophy was built on the new doctrine of l'offensive à outrance, the offensive to the utmost, drew a fatal conclusion. He declared that the age of static fortifications was over. The future of warfare was movement, élan, the bayonet charge. These static, buried forts were symbols of a failed defensive mindset. They were expensive relics. They were traps. They were liabilities. Worse, they were vast, useless magnets for men and material, hoarding heavy guns that were desperately needed on the active front lines where the real war was being fought. In August 1915, a full 6 months before the German storm broke over Verdun, Joffre signed the order that effectively condemned the entire fortress ring. He declared the forts decommissioned. They were to be downgraded, stripped of their modern guns, their garrisons reduced to skeleton crews, their ammunition stores emptied. The forts of Verdun, the supposed shield of France, were to be cannibalized. Their heavy cannons, the fast-firing 75s, the powerful 150s, were ripped from their armoured turrets and sent to the active front lines. Engineers began preparing the forts for demolition, planting explosives in their foundations, ready to blow them sky high the moment the Germans advanced. Fort Vaux was hit particularly hard by this order. Its primary offensive weapon, the rotating 155mm armoured turret, was dismantled, the gun hauled away. Its secondary quick-fire 75mm turret was also removed. The fort was left neutered. It was nothing more than a damp, underground barracks, a concrete observation post. The skeleton crew left behind lived in this eerie, abandoned shell. They were caretakers of a tomb. The air was permanently damp, the concrete walls weeping condensation. Rats skittered in the darkness of the magazine tunnels, now empty of shells. The wind whistled through the abandoned firing slits. The garrison's only job was to maintain the structure until it was time to destroy it. Crucially, in this process of decommissioning, the fort's water cistern, its only source of life in a siege, was damaged, or calculations for its capacity were lost. No one was certain how much water it actually held. It was an administrative oversight, a rounding error in a vast bureaucratic war, but it would prove to be the single most fatal detail of the entire battle. When the German offensive began in February 1916, the French realised their catastrophic error. The order to destroy the forts was frantically rescinded. They scrambled to rearm them, rushing men and machine guns back into the cold, empty tunnels. But it was too late to replace the heavy artillery that had been custom-built for the armoured turrets. Fort Vaux would face the most intense artillery bombardment in human history, with almost nothing. The Germans knew it was vulnerable. Before the first infantrymen even crossed the wire, the German super-heavy artillery focused on Vaux. For weeks, massive shells, weighing nearly a ton apiece, rained down. The fort's observation cupolas were smashed. The concrete superstructure was cracked, shattered and pulverised. And in one catastrophic direct hit, the fort's last remaining retractable gun turret, a 75mm gun, was destroyed. It was hit, jammed and silenced before it had fired a single shot in its own defence. When the Germans finally attacked, Fort Vaux was already a ruin. It was a concrete coffin, its guns silenced, its structure compromised. It was an unarmed tomb waiting for burial. Fort Vaux was a ghost long before the first German Sturmtruppen set foot on its roof. It was a concrete coffin, a monument to a forgotten age of warfare, a tomb built in the 1880s. Its very existence was not an act of aggression, but a national response to a profound, searing trauma. It was a key link in the Serre de Rivière system, the vast, sprawling 19th century defensive network that France constructed following the crippling national humiliation of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. That defeat, which had seen a French emperor captured on the battlefield and German armies marching triumphantly through Paris, had cost France its two most treasured provinces, Alsace and Lorraine. The Serre de Rivière system, a barrier of iron and concrete stretching across this new, wounded border, was France's solemn vow that this would never happen again. General Raymond Adolphe Serre de Rivière, its chief architect, envisioned a double curtain of interlocking fortresses that would channel any future German invasion into pre-prepared killing grounds. Fort Vaux, like its larger, more famous brother Douaumont, was a masterpiece of that specific era. It was an angular, semi-submerged structure of concrete and earth, a geometric marvel of interlocking fields of fire, engineered to withstand the heaviest artillery the 19th century could imagine, solid iron cannonballs and black powder shells. Its walls were thick, layered with many feet of non-reinforced concrete and compacted earth, a shell designed to absorb and dissipate the kinetic impact of solid shot. Its moat was deep, defended by flanking machine gun posts called coffres de contrecarpe. Its guns, housed in heavy armoured steel turrets or concrete casemates, were positioned with mathematical precision, creating a web of steel from which no 19th century army could escape. Upon its completion, the fortress ring of Verdun was considered by the finest military minds in Europe, including the Germans themselves, to be impregnable. It was the shield of France. But this was 1916, and in the 30-odd years since its construction, the science of killing had evolved far faster, far more monstrously, than the science of defence. A technological arms race had occurred, centred not on guns, but on explosives. The invention of picric acid-based high explosives, melinite in France, lyddite in Britain, granate Füllung 88 in Germany, changed everything. These new torpedo shells, or obus torpille, did not just shatter on impact. They did not just chip away at stone. They detonated with a chemical fury that was orders of magnitude greater than simple black powder. The enemy was no longer firing solid shot. They were firing high explosive shells, Minenwerfer, massive trench mortars, and most terrifyingly, super heavy siege artillery that had fundamentally rewritten the rules of war. The German 420mm Big Bertha and the Austrian 305mm Skoda howitzers, first unveiled against the Belgian forts at Liège and Namur in 1914, had proven that this entire concept of fortification was tragically obsolete. These new shells did not just hit, they pulverized. They did not bounce off. They plunged deep into the earthworks and masonry, penetrating many feet of serrades de rivières carefully layered concrete before detonating with an unimaginable volcanic force. They turned casemates into tombs. They cracked fortress structures open like eggs. They killed the garrisons inside through sheer earth-shattering concussion, liquefying organs, without leaving a single mark on the body. The French High Command, led by General Joseph Joffre, saw this. They watched in horror as the Belgian forts, identical in principle to their own, sister forts to Verdun, disintegrated in a matter of hours, not the weeks or months of siege doctrine. Joffre, a man whose entire military philosophy was built on the new, almost mystical doctrine of l'offensive à outrance, the offensive to the utmost, drew a fatal conclusion. He declared that the age of static fortifications was over. The future of warfare was movement, élan, the bayonet charge, the relentless spirit of the attack. These static, buried forts were symbols of a failed, defeatist mindset. They were expensive relics. They were traps. They were liabilities. Worse, in Joffre's eyes, they were vast, useless magnets for men and materiel, hoarding thousands of heavy guns that were desperately needed on the active front lines where the real war, the war of movement, was being fought. In August 1915, a full 6 months before the German storm broke over Verdun, Joffre signed the order that effectively condemned the entire fortress ring. He declared the forts decommissioned. They were to be downgraded, stripped of their modern guns, their garrisons reduced to skeleton crews, their ammunition stores emptied. The forts of Verdun, the supposed shield of France, were to be cannibalized. Their heavy cannons, the fast-firing 75s, the powerful 155s, were ripped from their armoured turrets by engineers and sent to the active front lines. The demolition crews moved in, planting explosives in the foundations, ready to blow the fort sky high the moment the Germans advanced, to deny them even the rubble. Fort Vaux was hit particularly hard by this order. Its primary offensive weapon, the rotating 155mm armoured turret, was dismantled, the massive gun hauled away by teams of horses. Its secondary quick-fire 75mm turret was also removed. The fort was left neutered. It was nothing more than a damp underground barracks, a concrete observation post. The skeleton crew left behind lived in this eerie, abandoned shell. They were caretakers of a tomb. The air was permanently damp, the concrete walls weeping condensation. Rats skittered in the darkness of the magazine tunnels, now empty of shells. The wind whistled through the abandoned, gunless firing slits. The garrison's only job was to maintain the structure until it was time to destroy it. And in this process of decommissioning, a fatal bureaucratic error was made. The fort's water cistern, its only source of life in a siege, was damaged, either by the early shelling or the process of demolition itself, or perhaps the calculations for its capacity were simply lost in a filing cabinet. No one was certain how much water it actually held, or how fast it was leaking. It was an administrative oversight, a rounding error in a vast, indifferent war, but it would prove to be the single most fatal detail of the entire battle. When the German offensive began in February 1916, the French realized their catastrophic error. The order to destroy the forts was frantically rescinded. They scrambled to rearm them, rushing men and machine guns back into the cold, empty tunnels. But it was too late. It was too late to replace the heavy artillery, the massive guns that had been custom-built for the armoured turrets. Fort Vaux would face the most intense artillery bombardment in human history, with almost nothing. The Germans knew it was vulnerable. Before the first infantryman even crossed the wire, the German super-heavy artillery, the 420mm monsters, focused on Vaux. For weeks, massive shells, weighing nearly a ton apiece, rained down. The fort's observation cupolas were smashed. The concrete superstructure was cracked, shattered and pulverized. And in one catastrophic direct hit, the fort's last remaining retractable gun turret, a 75mm gun that had been hastily reinstalled, was destroyed. It was hit, jammed and silenced before it had fired a single shot in its own defence. When the Germans finally attacked, Fort Vaux was already a ruin. It was a concrete coffin, its guns silenced, its structure compromised, its water supply failing. It was an unarmed tomb waiting for burial. Major Raynal, limping through his damp corridors, was a man preparing for a siege from the 1880s. He was arranging sandbags, checking firing slits, and meticulously rationing his questionable water supply, adhering to the timeless classical doctrines of fortress defence. But the enemy gathering in the shell holes just metres beyond his shattered walls was not an enemy from the 1880s. They were not even an enemy from 1914. They were the terrifying evolutionary result of 2 years of industrialised slaughter, a new breed of soldier forged in the very fires of Verdun itself. The German army, just like the French and the British, had learned a bloody, agonising lesson in the first 2 years of the war. Mass infantry assaults against machine guns and barbed wire do not work. It is mechanised suicide. It is the tactic of generals who have run out of ideas, of men who will trade 10,000 lives for 100 yards of mud. But where the British were beginning to dream of a purely mechanical solution, the armoured tank, and the French were clinging to Pétain's logistical resilience, the Germans had developed a new human solution, a new philosophy of the attack. They had created specialised elite units, the Sturmtruppen, the storm troops. These were not just regular infantry given a new name or a bit of extra training. They were a fundamentally different kind of soldier, selected from the fittest, the most aggressive, and most critically, the most intelligent men on the front. They were trained to value individual initiative above all else, a concept that was pure heresy to the old Prussian drill masters who believed the private soldier was a mere cog in the great state machine. They were the mirror opposite of the men who marched in rigid automaton lines at Minden or Waterloo. Their purpose was not to overwhelm by mass, but to infiltrate by stealth and shatter by focused violence. They were trained to bypass strong points, to flow like water into the gaps and around the machine gun nests, to attack the command posts, the artillery batteries, the weak seams of the enemy line. They were, in essence, land-based torpedoes designed to detonate deep inside the enemy's vital organs. And for the unique, claustrophobic task of cracking open a concrete fortress like Vaux, they were equipped with a horrifying arsenal of specialised tools, a kit designed specifically for close-quarters butchery in the dark. A stormtrooper's primary weapon was not his rifle. The standard Gewehr 98 was almost 2 metres long with its bayonet fixed. It was useless in a narrow, 2-metre-wide tunnel. His real weapons were carried in sacks, slung over his shoulders. Grenades, dozens of them. The iconic steel hand granate, the potato masher stick grenade, was the core of his arsenal. Its wooden handle allowed it to be thrown with greater accuracy and distance, using leverage, and it was designed primarily for concussion, to create a devastating, contained blast in a concrete room that would kill not just with shrapnel, but with pure, overpressured air that would rupture lungs. They also carried the Eierhandgranat, the small, egg-shaped grenade, easily concealed and thrown in rapid succession. They carried pistols, the Mauser C96 broom handle with its wooden stock, or the reliable Luger P08 for rapid, instinctive killing at arm's length. They carried daggers and trench clubs, medieval weapons for a futuristic war. And they carried their standard-issue shovels, but the edges were ground razor-sharp. The spade was a terrifying weapon in the dark, a tool for both digging and decapitating. Some wore experimental steel body armour, the Sappenpanzer, a heavy plate of chest armour that could, with luck, stop a pistol round or a bayonet, making them look like grotesque, mud-caked medieval knights. And then there was the most inhuman weapon of all, the Flammenwerfer, the flamethrower. This was a psychological weapon as much as a physical one, a heavy tank of nitrogen and flammable oil strapped to a man's back, a device designed to project a 50-foot jet of shrieking, burning liquid. It was a weapon of pure terror. Its purpose was to fill a concrete corridor with inescapable fire, to roast men alive in their machine gun nests, to consume the oxygen in the tunnels and suffocate the survivors. This was the force that gathered in the shell holes and ruined trenches just beyond Fort Vaux. This was the new face of war. Their target was not the front gate, which was covered by machine guns. Their target was the roof. Their tactic was infiltration. They knew the fort's main guns were silent. Their plan was to use the artillery-shattered landscape, the craters and piles of concrete rubble, to crawl onto the fort's superstructure. They would find the breaches blown by their own shells, the shattered observation cupolas, the twisted steel of the ventilation shafts. They would drop grenades and satchel charges into the darkness, fighting their way down into the fort, turning Raynal's fortress into a vertical battlefield, a three-dimensional nightmare. And before this assault could even begin, the German artillery, the engine of the Verdun mill, had to complete its work. The numbers are almost meaningless. They defy comprehension. In the final days of May, German artillery batteries ranging from their standard field guns to the massive 210mm and 305mm siege guns unleashed a final, preparatory storm. Estimates suggest that in the hours before the attack, shells were falling on the small, ruined footprint of Fort Vaux at a rate of 1,500 to 2,000 per hour. That is 30 shells a minute. A shell landing every 2 seconds, for hours on end. This was not a bombardment to kill the garrison. The garrison was metres below ground, huddled in the relative safety of the deep tunnels, though the concussion alone was driving men mad, causing eardrums to burst and sanity to fray. This was a bombardment to shatter the concrete, to blast open the routes of infiltration, to psychologically annihilate the defenders, to shake the very foundations of the earth until the men inside, deafened and terrified, believed the world itself was ending. On June 1st, 1916, after this final drum fire reached its screaming crescendo, the men with the grenades and the sharpened shovels and the flamethrowers rose from their shell holes. The assault began. On the 1st of June, 1916, the final preparation began. The German artillery, which had been methodically, relentlessly pulverizing the superstructure of Fort Vaux for weeks, now entered a new, final phase of terrifying intensity. This was the Zerstörungsfeuer, the fire of destruction. For 48 hours the guns did not stop. The men of the German 50th Division, specifically the pioneers of the 20th and 22nd Regiments, crouched in their advanced trenches, waiting. These were the elite. They were not the conscript masses who would march to their deaths in open fields. They were the Sturmtruppen, the storm troops, the new evolutionary model of soldier, forged in the very fires of Verdun itself. They had trained for this specific moment. They had studied maps, photographs, and models of Vaux until they knew its layout better than their own barracks. They knew its strengths, and, more importantly, they knew its fatal geometric flaws from a bygone era. Inside the fort, Major Raynal's garrison was living through a psychological and physical hell. The concrete shuddered continuously. The bombardment was no longer individual explosions, but a single, roaring, earth-shaking vibration that never ended. It was a physical weight that pressed down on the men, a sound so loud it ceased to be sound and became a violent, painful concussion. The air was thick with pulverized concrete dust, which coated the men's lungs and mixed with the oily smoke from their lanterns. In the main tunnels, meters underground, the concussions were powerful enough to extinguish lanterns, throw men from their bunks, and send dust and small fragments of concrete raining down from the vaulted ceilings. The garrison was trapped, blind and deaf, waiting. And then, at approximately 0400 hours on June 2nd, came the silence. A silence so sudden, so absolute, it was more terrifying than the noise. It was the signal. In the pre-dawn gloom, a grey, wet darkness mixed with poison gas, smoke, and a drizzling rain, the Sturmtruppen moved. They did not rise as one. They did not advance in lines. They did not blow whistles and charge. They flowed forward in small, fluid, self-contained groups, Stoßtrupps, each group a specialized unit of 8 to 10 men, led by an NCO. They were loaded not with rifles, which were long and useless for what was to come, but with the specific tools of this new, intimate warfare. Canvas sacks filled with dozens of style Handgranaten, the stick grenades, Mauser pistols and sharpened trench shovels strapped to their tunics, bags of explosives, and the terrifying Flammenwerfer, the portable flamethrowers, carried by specialized teams. They moved through the landscape their own artillery had just created, a hellish moonscape of churned mud, splintered trees, and the half-buried corpses of French soldiers from earlier, failed counterattacks. The French lookouts, peering from the few remaining armoured observation slits in the coffres, the machine gun bunkers defending the moat, saw almost nothing. The ground had been so pulverized by the weeks of shelling that it was impossible to distinguish a German Stahlhelm from a lump of broken concrete or a mangled tree stump. The Sturmtruppen were ghosts in the mud. The genius of the German attack, planned meticulously by Lieutenant Racker of Pioneer Battalion 20, lay in their cold, analytical understanding of Serre de Riviere's outdated design. Major Raynal, trapped inside his command post, was relying entirely on his coffres de contrescarpe to defend the fort. These were the flanking machine gun bunkers built into the outer wall of the deep, dry moat, designed to sweep the ditches with perfect interlocking fields of fire. Any attacker descending into the moat should, according to the textbooks of 1885, be instantly scythed down. But the German pioneers had studied the blueprints. They knew the angles mors, the blind spots. They found the precise geometric seams, the corners of the pentagonal structure where the machine guns simply could not aim. But they didn't just rely on that. Specialized German squads, who had crawled forward during the barrage, took up positions directly opposite the firing slits of the French coffres. As the French machine gunners opened fire into the darkness, they were met with a storm of concentrated rifle grenade fire and small mortar rounds. The Germans duelled the machine gun nests, pinning the gunners down, blinding them. Under the cover of this private, intense firefight, the main assault teams advanced. They reached the outer slopes of the fort, slid down the steep concrete banks into the deep, dry moat, and found themselves standing directly against the massive walls, perfectly safe. The French machine guns, firing furiously just metres above their heads, could not depress their aim low enough to hit them. The fort was blind at its own feet. Now the specialised tools came into play. The Sturmtruppen used small scaling ladders and grappling hooks, but mostly they used the raw debris of the bombardment itself. The shelling had piled mountains of shattered concrete and earth against the walls, creating rough, unintentional ramps. They climbed. They scrambled up the 30-foot slopes of the fort's superstructure, a sprawling, angular mass of concrete and earth now pockmarked and fractured. Within an hour of the assault beginning, hundreds of German pioneers were on the roof of Fort Vaux. They had achieved the impossible, suffering relatively few casualties. The entire French garrison, the 600 papas commanded by Raynal, was now effectively trapped underneath the enemy. This was not a siege. This was an infiltration. The Germans on the roof found a scene of total apocalyptic desolation. The armoured observation cupolas were twisted, black and steel. The main 75mm turret a mangled, useless ruin. The ground was a maze of craters, shell holes and tangled rebar. But the shells had also done the Germans' work for them. They had punched gaping holes, new skylights, through the metres of concrete, opening direct, ragged pathways into the dark corridors below. The Sturmtruppen gathered at these breaches, like surgeons probing a wound. They lit fuses and dropped their potato masher grenades into the darkness, listening for the muffled, subterranean crump of the explosion, followed by the faint, distant screams of the men below. Then they lowered themselves down with ropes, one by one, into the smoky, pitch-black labyrinth. In the northeast corner of the fort, a squad of pioneers found the shattered remains of a ventilation shaft. They began a systematic, terrifying process. Drop a grenade, wait for the blast, drop another, then descend a few more feet. Elsewhere, they found the mangled steel entrance to the main 75mm gun casemate, Casemate B. They used satchel charges, explosives bundled together, to blast the twisted steel door off its hinges, opening another route, this one leading directly into the fort's main artery. Inside the fort, chaos erupted. Major Raynal, in his central command post, received frantic, contradictory reports, not from lookouts, but from his own panicked men running through the tunnels. Germans in the northeast corridor, grenades exploding in the northern casemates, an explosion at the main casemate door. The enemy was inside. But how? The lookouts in the surviving armoured posts, peering through their narrow slits, could still see nothing in the moat. The machine guns in the coffres were still firing at ghosts, sweeping the empty ditches, wasting ammunition. Raynal realised the terrifying truth. They were not at the gates. They were above them. And they were coming down. He immediately dispatched his internal defence teams, squads of men armed with their own grenades and pistols, men he had specifically trained for this exact scenario, to meet the invaders. The battle for the corridors was about to begin. It was June 2nd. The battle for Fort Vaux, the battle inside Fort Vaux, had started. It would be a new kind of war, fought not under the sun, but in pitch darkness, metre by metre, in a concrete coffin. The war for Fort Vaux was now a subterranean nightmare. The battle on the roof was over. The battle in the dark had begun. This was not warfare as any soldier, French or German, had ever known it. It was not a fight for fields or towns or trenches. It was a claustrophobic, hand-to-hand brawl for control of a three-dimensional concrete labyrinth, fought metre by metre, in conditions that Dante himself could not have imagined. The electrical systems, of course, had been one of the first casualties, shattered by the initial bombardment. The world inside Vaux was now one of absolute primal darkness. A darkness broken only by the oily, flickering orange of German flamethrowers, the brief, blinding white flash of detonating grenades, and the dim, smoky lanterns of the French defenders. The air itself became a weapon. It was thick with pulverized concrete dust, toxic cordite fumes, the oily stench of burning fuel from the flamethrowers, and the rapidly growing, unbearable odour of human waste and unburied dead. The ventilation system was destroyed, and the air grew hotter and hotter, rising well above 100 degrees, recycled through the lungs of hundreds of panting, sweating, terrified men. Rifles were useless. Worse than useless. Their long level rifles, with the Rosalie bayonets fixed, stretched nearly 2 metres, impossible to aim, impossible to swing, impossible to even hold. In the narrow, choked confines of a 2-metre-wide corridor that was already filling with smoke and the bodies of the dead. This became a war of primitive, intimate weapons. The Sturmtruppen, advancing from their new footholds in the northern casemates, used their pistols, their trench clubs, and their razor-sharp shovels. But their primary weapon was the steel hand grenade, the potato masher. The German tactic was brutal and systematic. They advanced down a corridor until they met a French strongpoint. Then the assault would begin. First, the hiss, the most terrifying sound in the fort. A specialized pioneer, a man carrying a heavy steel tank of death on his back, would step forward and hose down the corridor with a 50-foot jet of liquid fire. The Flammenwerfer was designed to fill the enclosed space, the fire licking around corners, roasting the French machine gunners alive, consuming all the oxygen and forcing the survivors to choke in the superheated, toxic air. Then came the grenades. The Sturmtruppen tossed them in bundles, the potato mashers exploding with a deafening concussion crump that was magnified by the concrete walls, a sound so violent it burst eardrums and ruptured lungs, killing men who were never even touched by shrapnel. Then the assault team would rush forward through the smoke and fire, armed with pistols and sharpened shovels, to kill any day's survivors in the dark. But Major Raynal's men were not so easily broken. His foresight had saved them, for now. He had ordered his pappers to build secondary barricades inside the main tunnels. These were not the neat regulation sandbag walls of a training manual. They were desperate, ugly piles of rubble, broken bunks, ammunition boxes, sacks of cement, and the bodies of their own dead comrades, anything to slow the German advance. Behind these barricades, the French machine gunners fought with a suicidal bravery. They would set up their Hotchkiss guns, knowing they were the primary target, and fire short, controlled bursts into the darkness at the first sound of movement, the thud-thud-thud of the gun echoing like a hammer blow through the entire fort, the brass cartridges piling up in glittering heaps around their feet, the gun barrel itself glowing a dull, menacing red in the gloom. The battle devolved into a horrific, repetitive loop. 1. The Germans probe a corridor. 2. The French machine gun opens up. 3. The Germans retreat and call for the flamethrower. 4. The hiss, the jet of fire, the screams. The French machine gun team is incinerated. 5. The German grenade teams advance, bombing the position. 6. The German assault team takes the ruined, smouldering barricade. 7. The surviving French, further down the tunnel, frantically build another barricade, using the bodies of the men from the last one. Then the loop would begin again. Metre by agonizing metre, the Germans advanced, burning and blasting their way through Raynal's internal defences. The French defenders, choking on the smoke, their uniforms soaked in sweat, their faces blackened, began to run low on their most critical weapon: grenades. They had started with thousands, but the intensity of the fight was unimaginable. They were using hundreds per hour. Desperate, they resorted to the deadliest gamble of the war. When a German steel hand granite landed among them, its fuse hissing, they would dive for it, grab it, and hurl it back at the attackers, praying the fuse was long enough. Sometimes it was. Sometimes it was not. Men lost hands, faces, lives in this terrifying game of chance. And through it all, Major Raynal, the 49-year-old reservist, limped through the suffocating darkness, moving from barricade to barricade, his cane tapping on the rubble-strewn floor. He was not a shouting, charismatic leader. He was a quiet, stubborn presence. He spoke calmly to his men. He steadied the panicked. He redistributed ammunition. He coordinated the defence of a dozen different firefights happening simultaneously in a maze of identical-looking tunnels. He was the single point of cohesion in a world that had dissolved into pure, murderous chaos. The Germans were astonished. They had expected the fort to fall in hours. But these old reservists, these papas, led by a limping major, were fighting for every inch of concrete. The Sturmtruppen were elite, but they too were dying, burned by their own ricocheting flamethrowers, blown apart by their own grenades thrown back at them, shot in the dark by unseen defenders. The battle for the corridors of Fort Vaux became a personal duel between the German pioneers and Raynal's garrison, a stalemate measured in blood and smoke, fought in a concrete hell 200 feet below the surface of the earth. The Germans were winning territory, but they were paying for every single metre with the lives of their best men. And Raynal, knowing his men were at the breaking point, held on, because he knew that above ground the French army was trying desperately to save them. But his defence was about to be broken by an enemy far more relentless than the Sturmtruppen. The German Sturmtruppen had secured their footholds in the northern corridors, a bloody, hard-won prize. But the battle of grenades and flamethrowers had now reached a desperate, agonizing stalemate. The French papas, fighting from behind their improvised barricades of rubble and corpses, held their remaining tunnels with a fanatic's resolve. Major Raynal's men were proving impossible to dislodge. But on June 4, 1916, the tactical situation, the firefights in the tunnels, the control of the casemates, all of it suddenly became irrelevant. The gunfire, the explosions, the barbed wire, none of it mattered anymore. A new enemy, an enemy more patient, more inevitable, and infinitely more terrifying than the German pioneer, had taken supreme command of the battle. Thirst. The catastrophe had been set in motion weeks, perhaps even months earlier. The fort's main water cistern, the vast underground concrete reservoir designed to sustain the garrison for months of siege, had been compromised. Whether it was shattered by the unseen, earth-shaking concussion of the 420mm Big Bertha shells, or whether it had simply leaked from decades of neglect and the recent rushed attempts at demolition, the final result was the same. It was failing. Major Raynal, the meticulous administrator, had discovered this almost immediately upon taking command. He had seen the water level. He had done the grim calculation. And he had enforced brutal water discipline from the very moment the siege began, understanding that this single, failing resource was his true clock. A man can fight for days, even weeks, without food. He cannot fight for long without water. The first rations were 1/2 litre per day, a pathetic amount for men fighting in suffocating heat, but it was something. Then it was cut to 1/4 litre. Then it was measured in sips, a capful of lukewarm, metallic-tasting water doled out once every 12 hours. The priority, dictated by Raynal's unbending, almost cold sense of order, went to the wounded. The men lying in the suffocating subterranean hell of the medical aid station, their bodies burning with fever from infected wounds, their lungs raw from the poison gas. They received the last precious cupfuls. They were dying anyway, most of them, but Raynal dictated they would die with moisture on their lips. For the fighting men, for the healthy, for the soldiers still holding the barricades, there was nothing. By June 4th, the taps ran dry, the last barrel was empty, and the true, unimaginable hell of Fort Vaux began. The environment inside the fort was already a furnace. The temperature, with no ventilation, was trapped at over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. In the corridors nearest the fighting, where the repeated blasts from the German Flammenwerfer had turned the concrete walls into pizza ovens, it was far higher, perhaps as high as 120 degrees. The air itself was a toxic soup, a thick, unbreathable miasma. It was a fog of cordite fumes, poison gas residue, the oily kerosene-like stench of burning fuel from the flamethrowers, and the rapidly growing, unbearable sweet-sour odour of human waste and unburied dead. The fort's latrines were nothing more than overflowing buckets in a sealed, airtight environment. The bodies of men killed in the first tunnel fights were swelling and decomposing just metres away. The men were breathing poison. They were sweating out what little moisture their bodies had left. Their heavy woolen uniforms, designed for a cold winter, now acting as personal torture devices, heavy and sodden with toxic perspiration that could not evaporate. The agony of thirst is a unique and democratic torment. It is not a noble hunger. It is not a clean wound. It is a biological disintegration. It starts as a simple dryness in the throat. It becomes a thick, sticky, cloying paste. The tongue swells, becoming a dry, rough piece of leather, cleaving to the roof of the mouth until speech is impossible. The men's voices were reduced to a dry, rasping, inhuman croak. The lips crack open, splitting to the bone from the lack of moisture, bleeding a thick, dark blood that the men would then try to lick, just for the sensation of wetness. Saliva ceases to exist. Swallowing becomes an act of pure, agonizing pain, a torture repeated with every breath. The body, desperate, begins to consume itself. The skin becomes paper. The eyes sink deep into the skull. The mind begins to fray. The garrison of 600 men, surrounded by an estimated 10,000 German troops outside, was now fighting this internal, biological enemy. And they began to break. Discipline, order, training. All of it dissolved in the face of this primal need. Desperate men, their minds fogged and hot with dehydration, abandoned their posts. They were not fleeing the Germans. They were hunting for anything wet. They staggered through the pitch-black tunnels, their hands sliding along the weeping concrete walls of the deepest passages. They licked the walls. They scraped at the green, foul-smelling slime and algae that grew on the damp stone, stuffing the cold, gritty paste into their parched mouths. They knew it was madness. They knew the condensation was not pure. The fort's concrete, pulverized by the shelling, was porous. The ground above them was saturated with the remains of thousands of decomposing corpses, both French and German, rotting in the shell holes. The water seeping through the walls was, in effect, a diluted poison. a fluid laced with putrescine and cadaverine. They were, quite literally, drinking water from the dead. They knew it. They knew it would almost certainly give them typhus or cholera. But the short-term, screaming madness of thirst overwhelmed the long-term, abstract fear of disease. It was better to die of fever tomorrow than to live with this fire in the throat today. And when the walls were dry, when every last patch of slime had been scraped away, they turned to the last, most horrific source of liquid. They drank their own urine. Men would cup their hands, voiding what little, dark, burning, ammonia-filled fluid their kidneys could still produce, and drink it down, weeping in shame and desperation. This was the garrison of Fort Vaux. These were the heroes of Verdun. This was the reality of the defence. The psychological collapse followed the physical one. Men went mad. In the suffocating darkness, soldiers began to scream, not from wounds, but from delirium, their minds broken by the torment, shouting for their mothers, for rivers, for rain. Some hallucinated, seeing fountains in the dark corners of the casemates, trying to claw their way through the solid concrete to reach them. Fights broke out. Men were reportedly bayoneted by their own comrades, either in madness or in savage animalistic disputes over a single imagined drop of water. The entire fort, this symbol of French engineering, was descending into a subterranean bedlam. Through this all, Major Raynal, himself suffering the same agonizing dehydration, his limp now a painful, shuddering drag, moved among his men. He was the only thing holding the garrison together. He was the last thread of sanity. He moved from barricade to barricade, his voice a dry rasp, still demanding order, still demanding resistance. He was a commander no longer leading soldiers. He was a shepherd of the damned, holding his flock together in the very heart of hell. The Germans, sensing this internal collapse, hearing the screams, increased their attacks, throwing more grenades, firing more flame, believing the fort must surely fall at any moment. Raynal knew his men could not last another day. The Germans would not defeat them. The biology of the human body would. Major Raynal knew that his fort and the 600 lives within it had become an island. They were cut off. They were completely, terrifyingly blind. The telephone wires, their only electrical link to the outside world, had been pulverized by the artillery bombardment days ago, the line severed and shredded into useless copper spaghetti. The visual signalling posts, the heliographs and lanterns on the fort's superstructure were nothing but shattered concrete and twisted steel, exposed to a landscape where any man who showed his head for more than 1 second was instantly killed by German snipers. They could hear the war outside. They could feel the earth-shaking thump of friendly French artillery, the agonizing sound of their own army's counterattacks failing, falling short, the shells exploding uselessly against the German-occupied slopes. They could hear their salvation dying just a few hundred yards away. But they could not speak. They could not coordinate. They could not cry for help. They had only one link left, one fragile, desperate pre-modern line of communication. In a small, damp, foul-smelling room deep within the fort, next to the latrines and the overflowing medical station, was the colombière, the pigeon loft. Raynal had begun the siege with a handful of military carrier pigeons, the last resort of a besieged fortress. From the first day of the assault, he had begun sending them out, one by one. The process was a suicidal lottery. A soldier would take the bird, carefully roll Raynal's tiny tissue paper message into its aluminum leg capsule. He would then crawl through the pulverized rubble to a broken observation slit, a jagged hole in the concrete, and push the bird out into the daylight. And then they would pray. The Germans were not stupid. They knew about the pigeons. They had their own Taubenabwehrdienst, a pigeon defence service. Their best marksmen, their Scharfschützen, were positioned with high-powered rifles, their eyes scanning the sky above Vaux, waiting for that tiny flicker of grey feathers against the grey, smoky sky. The moment a bird was released, the rifles would crack. A puff of feathers, a small body tumbling back to the mud. Other birds, launched in the brief chaotic lulls of the bombardment, made it out of the immediate kill zone only to encounter an even more insidious enemy. The great, drifting yellow-green clouds of chlorine and phosgene gas that hung thick and heavy over the battlefield. The birds, flying low, would hit the chemical fog, their lungs burning, their wings faltering. They would flutter, disoriented, before falling from the sky, as dead as the men in the trenches below. One by one, Raynal had dispatched his hopes, and one by one they had vanished into the noise and the poison. By June 4th, 1916, after 3 days of relentless, subterranean combat, after the water had run out, after the air had become a toxic, unbreathable soup, Major Raynal, limping through the chaos of his command post, knew he had only one chance left. One. He summoned his columbophile, his pigeon keeper, and asked for the last bird. It was a pigeon identified only by its matriculation number, 787-15. This bird, small and trembling, was the last living voice of Fort Vaux. Raynal sat at his cluttered table, the air thick with the stench of the latrines and the gangrene from the medical bay. He took a tiny square of tissue paper and with a pencil wrote his final, desperate message. He did not beg. He did not plead. He reported as a soldier. "We are still holding," he wrote, "but we are under very dangerous attack from gas and fumes. It is urgent that we are relieved. We will not be able to hold for long. This is my last pigeon." The message was rolled and sealed. A soldier, himself weak with thirst, carried the bird through the suffocating tunnels, past the rows of moaning wounded, past the men lying on the floor, in a stupor of dehydration. He reached a shattered casemate, pushed open the heavy steel shutter just a crack, and thrust the bird out into the hell of the outside world. The pigeon, later given the name Violent or Valiant, was immediately in trouble. It had been breathing the same toxic, oxygen-starved air as the garrison for days. It was weak. It was disoriented by the Trommelfeuer, the continuous brain-shattering roar of the shelling. It launched from the soldier's hand, fluttered, and then, confused by the smoke, flew back inside the fort, landing on the floor in the darkness. The soldier's heart sank. It was over. He gently picked it up and, almost angrily, threw it back out into the poison air. This time, it flew. Violent rose into the sky above Fort Vaux, a sky thick with black smoke and yellow-green gas. It began to circle, trying to get its bearings, a tiny, fragile target against the bruised sky. Immediately, the German rifles opened up. Crack, crack, crack. The bullet snapped past the bird. It faltered, dropped, then surged upward, finding its instinct, finding the direction home. It flew straight towards Verdun, towards the citadel, where its home loft was. But to get there, it had to fly directly through the densest concentrations of poison gas, the very clouds that were being pumped towards the fort. The bird plunged into the yellow fog. Its flight became erratic. Its lungs, tiny and delicate, were seared by the chlorine. Its eyes burned. It was dying in mid-air, poisoned. But its ancient, incomprehensible instinct to return home was stronger than the chemical weapons of a new industrial war. It flew on. Hours later, at the citadel of Verdun, the headquarters of the French Second Army, a columbophile on duty heard a faint sound. A single bird, flapping heavily, crashing against the landing board of the mobile loft. He ran to it. It was Vaillant. The bird was almost dead. It was shuddering violently, its feathers matted, its eyes clouded, its beak open in a silent gasp. A dark, toxic mucus bubbled from its nostrils. It had made it. The handler, with gentle, practiced hands, removed the tiny aluminum capsule from its leg. He saw the bird was dying. He unrolled the message, saw the name Raynal and the word Vaux, and he ran. He ran from the loft, down the steps of the citadel, to the central command post, where he handed the flimsy, gas-stained piece of paper to the duty officers. The generals read the message in stunned, reverent silence. They knew what it meant. They knew the cost of its delivery. Vaillant, matricule 787-15, collapsed in his handler's hands. His mission was complete. He died moments later. The message was delivered. The High Command knew the exact desperate situation inside Fort Vaux. But the news of this one bird's flight, this single act of desperate, dying loyalty, spread faster than any army order. It became an instant legend. The French government, seizing on this perfect symbol of sacrifice, formally awarded the bird, Vaillant, the citation à l'ordre de la nation. It was the highest honour, the equivalent of a medal for valour, given to a pigeon. It was a symbol. But for Raynal and his 600 men, still dying of thirst in the dark, it was too late. The message had been delivered, but help was not coming. By the morning of June 7th, 1916, the battle was no longer a battle. It was a death watch. Major Raynal, his own throat burning, his body failing, his mind fighting the fog of dehydration, looked at the men who remained. They were no longer soldiers. They were ghosts. They were grey shadows huddled in the suffocating darkness, their uniforms stiff with dried sweat, blood and filth. They were too weak from thirst to lift their rifles, too delirious to properly follow commands. The last of the machine guns, the Hotchkiss guns that had barked defiance for 7 days, had not been silenced by German grenades, but by the simple biological failure of the men operating them, who had finally collapsed from exhaustion and dehydration at their posts. The grenade supply, the currency of this subterranean war, was gone. The final, desperate barricades, built from broken beds and the bodies of their own comrades, were unmanned. The Germans, sensing this final, agonizing silence, this unnatural quiet after a week of continuous, echoing violence, were massing in the captured tunnels for one last push. Raynal, the meticulous administrator, the man of iron duty, finally made the calculation. He had obeyed his orders. He had held to the last. But when did the last officially arrive? Was it when the last bullet was fired, or when the last man died of thirst? He could not ask his men, the men who had licked slime from the walls and drunk their own urine, to die for one more hour of pointless resistance against an enemy who was now effectively just waiting for them to die. He had sacrificed everything for French honour, but he would not sacrifice the last of his men to pure, agonizing futility. He turned to his few remaining officers, their faces unrecognizable, and gave the final order: surrender. The act itself was almost impossible. Who had the strength to deliver the message? A stick was found. A piece of cloth, once white, now a ragged grey-brown square, stiff with concrete dust and dried blood, was tied to the end. A single, unarmed French soldier, himself staggering, his breath a dry, rasping sound, crawled from a shattered firing slit in the western casemate and waved the flag of capitulation. In the tunnels, the German Sturmtruppen, who were preparing their flamethrowers and grenade bundles for the final, bloody assault, paused. The hissing of their weapons, the shouted commands, the scrape of boots on rubble. It all stopped. The firing from outside, the endless trommelfeuer, also seemed to lessen, as if the entire battlefield of Verdun was holding its breath. The sudden silence was more profound, more deafening than the bombardment had been. The Battle of Fort Vaux was over. German pioneers, led by officers of the 50th Division, advanced cautiously through the breaches, their Mauser pistols still raised, their sharpened shovels ready, expecting a trap. They entered the main corridors of Fort Vaux, and they stopped. They were hardened men. They were elite soldiers. They were veterans who had seen the worst horrors the Western Front could produce, from the poison gas clouds of Ypres to the meat grinder of Verdun itself. But what they found inside Vaux broke their composure. The air that hit them was a physical blow. It was a solid wall of heat, estimated at over 130 degrees Fahrenheit near the fighting. An oven blast. It was not the clean smell of cordite. It was the complex, sweet, gagging odour of mass human putrefaction, of gangrene, of 7 days of overflowing latrines, of ammonia, of 600 men buried alive for a week. And then their eyes adjusted to the gloom, lit only by the smoky lanterns of the German pioneers. They saw the defenders. They saw the papas of the garrison, men who were not warriors, but living skeletons, their faces hollowed out, their skin like grey parchment stretched over skulls. They saw the Vaux face, a uniform mask of black stubble, cracked, blackened lips, and sunken eyes burning with fever and delirium. They saw men lying on the floor in their own filth, too weak to move. They saw men who, upon seeing the German uniforms, did not reach for rifles, did not even show fear. They simply croaked, a single, inhuman, rasping word that every German understood. Wasser. Water. The Sturmtruppen, the men who had spent 7 days trying to kill these same soldiers with flamethrowers and grenades, were overcome. They lowered their weapons. They did not shout. They did not celebrate. They stopped. And then, in one of the most profound, spontaneous acts of humanity in the entire war, the German soldiers, without waiting for orders from their officers, began to move among the defeated. They unslung their own canteens. They knelt by the dying Frenchmen and poured precious clean water onto their cracked, bleeding lips. It was a moment of grace, a moment of shared human decency in the very heart of an inhuman hell. Major Raynal, leaning on his cane, his uniform in tatters, his face a mask of exhaustion and duty, prepared himself for the final humiliation of surrender. He was escorted through the ruins of his fort, past his surviving men who were weeping, not in defeat, but in the agonizing, life-giving relief of tasting water. He was led up the shattered steps, out of the subterranean darkness, and into a world he had not seen for 7 days. He blinked in the painful, grey daylight, a daylight still thick with smoke, his lungs aching from the sudden shock of fresh air. He was brought before the German field commander, a pioneer lieutenant named Rack, one of the officers who had led the assault. Raynal, ever the professional, ever the old-school soldier, drew himself up to his full height. He unclipped his officer's sword to hand it over, the traditional, symbolic gesture of a defeated commander, the offering of his personal honour. The German officer looked at the sword. He looked at the ruined fort behind Raynal. He looked at the limping, skeletal, but unbroken major, and he saluted. He refused to take the sword. The honour of such a defence, he declared, placed Major Raynal and his garrison above the normal rituals of surrender. This respect from the enemy was perhaps the greatest victory of all. The legend only grew from there. As Raynal was led into captivity, he was marched past ranks of German soldiers, the same men who who had been trying to kill him. They did not mock him. They did not jeer. They stood to attention. Some even saluted the column of survivors as they passed. He was eventually brought as a figure of immense military curiosity before the German Crown Prince Wilhelm himself, the commander of the entire Fifth Army at Verdun. The Crown Prince, who had watched this tiny, obsolete fort derail his army's timetable and devour thousands of his best men, was not angry. He was, by all accounts, in awe. He famously asked Raynal his rank, and upon hearing he was a mere major, expressed his astonishment that such a defence had been conducted by an officer of relatively junior status. He praised Raynal's courage. "Major, you and your men have covered yourselves in glory." The story, which would become one of the most enduring legends of the war, perhaps embellished by time, but rooted in this moment of mutual respect, is that Crown Prince Wilhelm, in an unprecedented gesture for a captured enemy, tried to present Raynal with a German Iron Cross. Raynal, of course, politely refused. He was a prisoner of war, not a guest, but the gesture, true or not, cemented the legend of Fort Vaux. Raynal had lost his fort. He had been defeated, but he had saved the honour of his men, and he had won the undying respect of the very enemy who had tried for 7 days to incinerate him. Fort Vaux had fallen. Tactically, it was a German victory. A small, stubborn red circle on the Crown Prince's battle map, deep in the rear headquarters, could finally be shaded over in German blue. It was done. But as the first coherent after-action reports began to filter back from the 50th Division, as the surviving Sturmtruppen, those who were not dead or wounded or simply mad from the 7-day ordeal, were withdrawn from the line, a different, more terrible calculation began to emerge. This was not a calculation of captured ground or enemy prisoners. This was the cold, hard logic of the Verdun meat grinder. This was the true mathematics of attrition. And the numbers, when they were finally tallied, were sickening. They did not speak of victory. They spoke of a hemorrhage. Major Raynal's garrison, those papas and reservists, had numbered somewhere between 600 and 700 men at the start of the assault, including the machine gunners, sappers, and medical staff. Of those, the number killed outright during the 7-day siege, from flamethrowers, grenades, and shell fire, was astonishingly low, perhaps only 50 to 100 men in total. The true cost for the French was paid by the survivors. Hundreds were marched into captivity, but they were prisoners already broken by thirst, starvation, and the onset of disease. Many, perhaps most, of the wounded who were captured would die in German prisoner-of-war hospitals in the coming weeks, their bodies too ravaged by the typhus and dysentery contracted from drinking the poisoned, corpse-tainted water that had seeped through the fort's concrete walls. But the price the Germans paid for this single, ruined, obsolete concrete shell, it defied all military logic. It called into question the very sanity of the entire Verdun offensive. Historians and staff officers, even today, still struggle to untangle the precise German casualty figures for the 7-day assault on Vaux from the wider, relentless, daily slaughter of the surrounding Verdun front. The fighting was too chaotic, the record-keeping too fractured by the sheer scale of the violence, the battle for the fort too intertwined with the battle for the surrounding trenches. But the consensus estimates, pieced together from German regimental histories and after-action reports, are staggering. To capture one fort, held by 600 reservists with no heavy artillery, no observation, and, critically, no water, the German Fifth Army, under the command of the Crown Prince, expended somewhere between 2,700 and 4,000 of their own men, killed and wounded. And these were not the average conscripts. They were not the Landswehr or Landsturm cannon fodder. The vast majority of these casualties were from the elite pioneer battalions of the 50th Division. They were the Sturmtruppen. They were the very men the German army had spent 2 years meticulously training, equipping, and cultivating. They were the specialists, the innovators, the men who were supposed to solve the riddle of the trenches. And they had been fed into the mill, squad by squad, to take a position that had no strategic value whatsoever once it was captured. The Germans had paid, perhaps, with the lives of 3,000 or more of their best soldiers to defeat a garrison of 600 reservists. They had traded 4, perhaps 5, of their elite engineers and assault troops for every one of Raynal's papas. This was not victory. This was a catastrophic failure of military accounting. This was a hemorrhage of the army's most precious, irreplaceable resource. Falkenhayn's plan, if it ever truly was to bleed France white while conserving his own strength, was backfiring spectacularly. The mill was grinding up the grinder. The 7 days. That was the true prize. The 7 days that Major Raynal had bought with his garrison's suffering, with their thirst, with their madness, were invaluable to the French High Command. While the German elite was breaking its teeth, burning its fuel, and exhausting its grenade supplies in the dark tunnels of Vaux, General Pétain and his successor General Nivelle were given one full, uninterrupted, critical week. It was a week they used not just to rest, but to work. French artillery, the famous 75s, were repositioned. New batteries were dug in, their guns pre-sighted on the approaches from Fort Vaux, turning the newly captured fort into a new German death trap. French reinforcements, divisions pulled from quieter sectors, were rushed up the Voie Sacrée and plugged into the line, digging new, hasty trenches in the Ravine de la Dame, just behind Vaux, shoring up the next layer of defence. The Germans, in capturing this one small, symbolic node, had exhausted the very Sturmtruppen divisions they needed to exploit the breakthrough. When they tried to push past the captured fort toward their next objective, the Souville redoubt, they were met not by a panicked, disorganised rabble, but by fresh French troops, dug in, supported by a wall of perfectly sighted artillery. The German momentum, which had seemed so irresistible in February, was gone. It had died in the dark. It had bled out on the floor of Raynal's tunnels. The capture of Fort Vaux, which should have been a triumphant moment for the German army, a moment broadcast across the world as proof of their inevitable victory at Verdun, instead became a quiet, horrifying symbol of their frustration. It was a perfect, bloody microcosm of the entire, futile Verdun campaign. They were winning ground. They were capturing objectives. But they were winning at a cost that would, in the end, ruin them. They had taken the concrete coffin. But the spirit of the men inside, the stubbornness of the limping major and his papas, had already dealt the German Fifth Army a wound from which it would never fully recover. The battle for Fort Vaux was over, but the story of Fort Vaux had only just begun. As Major Raynal and the skeletal survivors of his garrison were marched into German captivity, the news of their defence, especially the final, desperate human details, was spreading like wildfire across a war-weary France. The French High Command, itself reeling from the daily slaughter of the Verdun offensive, and desperate for any narrative that was not one of purely mechanical attrition, recognised the value of this story instantly. It was not a story of defeat. It was a story of defiance. This was a story of 600 papas, middle-aged reservists, led by a single, limping 49-year-old major, holding off 10,000 of Germany's elite Sturmtruppen for 7 days. The tale of the fight in the dark, the men licking slime from the walls, the final agonizing torment of thirst, all of it transformed from a military disaster into a national epic of resilience. It was the perfect propaganda. It captured the exact spirit that General Pétain was trying to instill in the entire French army. This was not a story about tactical failure. It was a story about spiritual victory. And at the absolute centre of this new, potent legend was the smallest, most fragile hero of all, the pigeon, Vaillant, the story of Matricule 787-15, the last bird, launching from the shattered, gas-filled ruins of the fort, flying through a storm of German shrapnel and chemical fog, its own lungs searing, dying as it delivered its final message of defiance. This was a gift to the French press. It was a symbol so pure, so painfully potent, that it transcended the mud and the slaughter. Vaillant posthumously awarded the citation à l'Ordre de la Nation and entered into the pantheon of national heroes, became a household name, a feathered Joan of Arc, a testament that even the smallest creature could embody the unbreakable will of France. Raynal, the stubborn major, became the embodiment of the French father, the poilu, refusing to yield. French propaganda posters and postcards featuring the pigeon and the stoic bearded major were printed by the tens of thousands. They reinforced the central, critical message of the entire Verdun campaign, the four words that held a nation together: Ils ne passeront pas, they shall not pass. This moral victory was perhaps more important than any tactical gain. 1916 was the darkest year of the war for the Allies. The British Army was, at that very moment, preparing for its own massive, bloody offensive on the Somme, an attack designed in large part to relieve the agonizing, bone-breaking pressure on Verdun. But Verdun remained a uniquely French battle. The Somme would become a shared Anglo-French trauma. But Verdun was where the French army stood alone, fighting for the literal soil of its homeland. The defence of Fort Vaux, this 7-day stand against impossible odds, became the symbol of that lonely national struggle. It fortified the morale of the entire nation. If Raynal and his men could endure that, the darkness, the fire, the thirst, then the soldiers in the trenches, the civilians in the factories, and the politicians in Paris, they too could endure. The fort's loss was irrelevant. Its defence was everything. And while the story of Vaux inspired France, it had the opposite, corrosive effect on the German High Command. They had the fort, but what exactly had they won? They had captured a pulverized, useless ruin, a concrete tomb full of French dead, and more importantly, their own. They had spent 7 days, thousands of their best Sturmtruppen, and an unimaginable quantity of shells to take a single, obsolete objective that was now itself a perfect pre-sighted target for French artillery. The French guns, having been repositioned and reinforced during that crucial, week-long delay, simply began pounding the Germans inside Vaux, just as the Germans had pounded the French. The fort became a liability, a forward post that was impossible to supply and agonizing to hold. The German offensive at Verdun, already slowing, ground to a halt. The capture of Vaux and the subsequent equally bloody capture of the Thiaumont redoubt and the village of Fleury in June and July marked the high water mark of the German advance. They had bled themselves white, just as they had bled France. The mill had ground both armies to dust. The German offensive spirit, the driving, arrogant belief in victory at Verdun, died in those dark, suffocating, waterless tunnels. The strategic failure was confirmed just a few months later. In the autumn of 1916, the French army, now under the aggressive, offence-minded command of General Robert Nivelle, launched its own stunning counter-offensives. Using new artillery tactics, including the creeping barrage, they began to reclaim the land they had lost, inch by bloody inch. Fort Douaumont, the great prize the Germans had captured so easily in February, was retaken by French colonial marines in a brilliant assault in October. And then, on November 2, 1916, French assault troops advanced on Fort Vaux, expecting a bloody, protracted fight, a mirror image of the battle in June. But when they reached the walls, they found it empty. The Germans, realizing the position was untenable, ravaged by French artillery, riddled with disease, and impossible to resupply, had abandoned it without a fight. They slipped away in the night. The tricolour, the flag of France, was raised over the shattered, silent ruin. Major Raynal, by then a prisoner of war in Germany, heard the news from his captors. His fort had been retaken. His sacrifice, and the sacrifice of his men, had been vindicated. When Major Raynal finally returned to France from the prisoner of war camps in 1918, he was hailed as a hero. He was promoted. He received the Grand Cross of the Légion d'honneur, the nation's highest honour. His name was spoken with the same reverence as the great marshals of old, but he knew the reality. He knew the cost of turning a concrete coffin into a national symbol. He knew what that victory actually smelled like. The Battle of Fort Vaux teaches us a terrifying, paradoxical lesson, one that strips away all the romance of warfare. It teaches us that sometimes the greatest victories, the moments that truly define a nation's soul, do not look like victories at all. They do not look like the glorious cavalry charges of Murat. They do not look like the sweeping tactical genius of Napoleon at Austerlitz. They do not look like flags being raised over a captured palace. Sometimes national salvation looks like 600 exhausted, middle-aged men trapped in total, suffocating darkness. It looks like men fighting over a puddle of poison slime. It looks like a garrison reduced to the most primal, animalistic state, drinking their own urine, yet still refusing to surrender. It looks like a commander, his own lips cracked and black, choosing to endure one more hour, and then one more hour, in the full, agonizing knowledge that his own army's rescue attempts had failed, and that they would not be saved. Today, Fort Vaux is quiet. It is a ruin, covered in grass and trees, the concrete shattered and scarred, but peaceful. The tunnels are cold and damp and silent. You can walk them. You can stand in the exact spot where the Sturmtruppen blasted their way in. You can see the rusted remains of the machine guns, the calcified sandbags of the final barricade. And you can feel the oppressive weight of the silence. The fort is no longer a strategic asset. It is a memorial. It is a testament, not to the genius of tactics or the glory of empires, but to the simple, stubborn and terrifying capacity of the human spirit to endure. It reminds us that the true spirit of Verdun was not the grand strategy of the generals. It was the biological, agonizing decision to hold on, in the dark, for one more minute.